Hey there friend, good morning, how's it going? I hope you're having a nice day, because today we're going back to the Great War and find out who was the last man to die. And he was possibly the unluckiest guy of his generation, and that for many reasons. You'll understand why soon enough. War is at the center of human history. Since the dawn of mankind, violence has been used in the name of everything. From the survival of one group over another, to greed, to simple psychotic rage. Ironically, wars are the greatest stimuli to scientific creativity. The greatest minds are born and made in chaos. Today's society has been built on yesterday's ashes, and our best inventions on the atomic fire that swept clean yesterday's memories. But enough of that for today, that's not what we're here for. So it's no secret that war raises many questions, and today's question is, who was the last person to die in the Great War? And thanks to my addiction to ask myself very odd and specific questions, I have an answer to share with you. And I mean answers. And of course, as always, it was more complex than I thought, so stay till the end. But before we start, I need to introduce you to someone. So let's meet the unluckiest guy of the Great War. Henry Nicholas John Gunther, and he was born on June 6, 1895 in East Baltimore, Maryland. He was the son of George Gunther and Lena Roth. The important detail here is that both his parents were children of German immigrants. And you'll see later on, that's gonna be a very important detail. And like many German Americans who settled in Baltimore since 1866, he grew up in Island Town. He landed a job as a bookkeeper and clerk at the National Bank of Baltimore. And looks like he lived a rather comfortable life. And if judged by our current standards, it seems he was starting his life pretty decently. Except for maybe one little detail. You see, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Europe was being ravaged by a massive conflict called the Great War. At some point, it had to go downhill. Since you've read the title, you probably already have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen to him. But like everything in life, even with bad luck, what truly matters is the journey and not the destination. Even when the journey is a succession of disappointments. Sorry, that's not a very cheerful quote. But now that you know a little bit more about him, time to get into his story. Unlike many young men who volunteered, Henry wasn't really fond of the idea. But in September 1917, 5 months after the US declared war on Germany, Henry was called to serve, and that's a fancy way to say he was drafted. Quite frustrated, he left his job, his family, and his fiancée to go to France. He was assigned to the 313th Infantry Regiment, also known as Baltimore Zone, since most of the men were from Baltimore, and arrived in France in July 1918, and then at the Western Front with his unit on September 12. Of course, as unlucky as he was, he first got demoted from sergeant to private for writing a letter to a friend to convince him not to enlist and basically directly criticize the war. And maybe the Western Front wasn't all that comfortable after all, but demoted for writing a letter, even if that doesn't seem that big of a deal, the problem is, you weren't supposed to say those things. And in fact, the soldiers were told what they could say and not to say. It was supposed to keep the morale high back home. So, naturally, when his letter reached the military censors, it didn't quite fit the criteria, and he ended up being demoted. Unfortunately, because of his German heritage, his comrades suspected something even worse. And it was more complex than simply not liking being there, but also sympathizing with the enemy. And to give you some context, back home, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment. But remember, he's from the biggest German-American community in Baltimore, and the men serving with him are also from Baltimore. So that detail was pretty hard to miss for them. Also, I should mention that during that time, as if it wasn't already bad enough, his fiancée left him. A few days after being demoted, his regiment went into action, and to the surprise of his comrades, he was unusually willing to take a lot of risks and expose himself to danger. And so began his quest to prove everyone that he was a true American. Seeking redemption, he volunteered as a runner. Runners were tasked to deliver important pieces of information from one unit to another. They were also skilled map readers, and the secondary task was to guide troops into another area of the battlefield. On top of that, it was probably the hardest and riskiest job in the Great War. But I'm sure the Thunderers will have something to say about that. In November 1918, He was injured in the wrist, but with all his determination to prove his patriotism, he insisted on staying and kept performing like nothing happened. It meant so much to him that this alone proved how much he loved his country. And just a few days later, on November 11, 1918, at 5 in the morning, in Compiègne Forest, that's about 50 miles northeast of Paris, was signed the armistice, was to come into effect at 11 o'clock to give time to the information to reach everyone. In the morning, a runner reached Henry's unit fighting in the village of Chaumont-devant-Damvillers and told them to hold the line, that the war would end in a few minutes at 11 o'clock. Maybe not everyone was aware after all, because as Henry's squad approached a roadblock of 2 German machine guns, Henry Gunther disobeyed the order of his friend and sergeant Ernest Powell and charged the machine gun with his bayonet. Aware that it was only a matter of seconds before the end of the war, the German soldiers tried to wave him off. His comrades yelled at him to stop, and so did the Germans in their broken English. I don't know what was going through his mind, but I assume he was extremely determined to prove his worth one last time. He didn't listen and kept charging, firing a shot at 2 other Germans, leaving them no other choice. They opened fire at him. He was hit in the left temple and collapsed in the mud. It was 10:59. Just a few seconds later, the guns finally fell silent, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month. He was 23 years old. Which brings us to the next part. How can we know for sure he was the last man to lose his life? The next day, General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, mentioned Henry Gunther as the last American soldier killed in the Great War. Later, the Army posthumously restored his rank of sergeant and he was awarded the Purple Heart, a divisional citation for gallantry in action, and the Distinguished Service Cross. He was buried in his family plot in Baltimore, and you can read on his grave, highly decorated for exceptional bravery and heroic action that resulted in his death 1 minute before the armistice. We'll never know what his motive was. Maybe it was just the mind of a conflicted young man who thought he needed to prove something. But a few years ago, unfortunately, a fire destroyed his family home. Even dead, the guy can catch a break. The only thing that survived was his Purple Heart. Now you may think the story ends here, but like always, it's not that simple, especially when millions of people are involved. He may be the last man killed in action accounted for before 11 o'clock, but he certainly isn't the last casualty of the Great War. Many men died from their injuries over the next days or weeks. Only on the last day, before 11 a.m., 11,000 casualties were accounted. 2,500 to 3,000 of them died in a 6-hour delay between 5 a.m. when the armistice was signed and 11 a.m. when it took effect. Some commanders didn't receive any instructions and kept attacking fiercely until the very last minute. But now the fact is, the guns going silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month sound quite poetic, but in some places, the fighting continued during and after 11 o'clock, including on the Western Front. The message also didn't reach East Africa that easily, and to give you an idea, a telegram sent to East Africa from Europe could take an entire day to arrive. In East Africa, Major General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck and his men faced the Allies on November 12. He only received the news that the war had ended later. Lettow-Vorbeck formally surrendered on November 25th, so 1 month before Christmas. Now let's go back north and take a look at Russia. Before November 1918, the Civil War was raging in the motherland.
Теперь самым главным вопросом, который стоит перед партией коммунистов, который больше всего привлек к себе внимание на последнем.
The Bolsheviks' ambition wasn't really welcomed by the Allies and some newly formed independent countries such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The armistice agreement says that German troops in the Baltics should stay just in case the Bolsheviks got a little bit too ambitious, because newly formed country means quite vulnerable. After the armistice, the Allies kept sending more and more troops in the region. It wasn't really the Great War anymore, but they were still losing soldiers. It still took 2 years for the British, colonial and imperial troops to be demobilized, and during that time, there is no doubt that some more soldiers were lost. But wait, there is one last contender, a Lieutenant Thomas, who was probably the last German casualty on the Western Front, was shot shortly after 11 o'clock on November 11, 1918, while approaching American soldiers to tell them the war was over. I guess they didn't know. Probably. Officially, the Great War ended on June 28, 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles was signed, not when the armistice was signed on November 11th. And to put it simply, an armistice is just a ceasefire. Considering all this, Sergeant Henry Gunther went down in history as the last man to be killed in the Great War, and that's the official version anyway. And to conclude this, I leave the final words to Nikola Tesla, who wants to tell you something. Like and subscribe. Do it. And I'd like to know your opinion in the comments. Do you think he would have had a different outcome for Henry if he didn't let his desire to prove himself cloud his judgment? The lesson here is that sometimes our ego makes us do stupid things. So that was my first video ever. I hope it wasn't too bad. But anyway, thank you for watching. See you next time.